The Nazis thought their codes were unbreakable. They had no idea that a group of people with superhuman memory abilities were reading every single message they sent. This is the untold story of how a secret team used ancient memory techniques to crack the impossible, save millions of lives, and change the course of human history. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how they did it and why their methods are being hidden from you today. It's 1939. Britain just declared war on Germany, and the British government has a massive problem. The Germans are using a machine called Enigma to encrypt all their military communications. Every message about troop movements, battle plans, submarine locations. All of it is being scrambled into gibberish that seems impossible to decode. The Enigma machine looks like a typewriter, but it's way more complex. When you press a key, it doesn't just type that letter. It sends an electrical signal through a series of rotating wheels called rotors. Each rotor scrambles the letter in a different way. Then the signal bounces off a reflector and goes back through the rotors again, scrambling it even more. The result is that if you type the letter A, it might come out as Q, but if you type A again a second later, it might come out as M. The scrambling pattern changes with every single keystroke. And here's the really nasty part. The Germans change the rotor settings every single day at midnight. So even if you somehow figured out today's settings, they'd be useless tomorrow. British intelligence calculated that there were over 150 trillion possible settings for the Enigma machine. That's 150,000 different combinations. Testing them all would take longer than the age of the universe. So the British did something desperate. They put out a secret call for the smartest people in the country, but they weren't looking for soldiers or spies. They were looking for chess champions, mathematicians, crossword puzzle experts, and people with exceptional memories. These people were brought to a top secret location called Bletchley Park, about 50 miles north of London, and what happened there would remain classified for 30 years after the war ended. The team at Bletchley Park included some of the greatest minds of the 20th century. Alan Turing, who basically invented the concept of the computer. Gordon Welchman, a mathematical genius. Dilly Knox, a classical scholar, who could read ancient Greek like it was English, and dozens of others whose names you've never heard because their work was kept secret for decades. But here's what most people don't know about these codebreakers. Yes, they were smart. Yes, they were good at math and logic. But the real secret to their success was something completely different, something that had nothing to do with mathematics or machines. These people had trained their memories to do things that seem impossible, and the techniques they used weren't new. They were ancient methods that had been used for thousands of years, but had been mostly forgotten by the modern world. Let me tell you about Mavis Lever. She was 19 years old when she joined Bletchley Park. She studied German in college, but had no background in cryptography or mathematics. On paper, she had no business being there. But Mavis had a skill that made her invaluable. She could hold enormous amounts of information in her head simultaneously and see patterns that others missed. One day in 1941, Mavis was working on intercepted Italian naval codes. The Italians were using their own version of Enigma, and their messages were even harder to crack than the German ones. Mavis was staring at a message that made no sense, just random letters. But something about it bothered her. She couldn't explain what it was, just a feeling that something was off. She closed her eyes and replayed in her mind every Italian message she'd seen in the past 3 months. Not just the decoded messages, but the encrypted ones too. The gibberish, the patterns of letters, the frequencies. She had memorized all of it without even trying. And then she saw it. A pattern. A tiny, almost invisible repetition in the way certain letters appeared. It was so subtle that no one else had noticed it. But Mavis had the entire corpus of messages stored in her memory, and when she compared them all at once in her mind, the pattern jumped out. She used this pattern to make a breakthrough that led to cracking the Italian naval code. And because of this breakthrough, the British Navy knew exactly where the Italian fleet would be during the Battle of Cape Matapan. The result? The British destroyed 3 Italian heavy cruisers and 2 destroyers while suffering almost no losses themselves. Over 400 Italian sailors died, and the balance of power in the Mediterranean shifted in favor of the Allies, all because a 19-year-old girl could remember patterns that no one else could see. But Mavis wasn't unique at Bletchley Park. Almost everyone there had these kinds of memory abilities, and it wasn't because they were born special, it's because they'd been trained. See, the British government knew something that most people today have forgotten. They knew that memory isn't a fixed trait. It's a skill that can be developed to extraordinary levels if you use the right techniques. And they knew this because there was a long tradition in Britain of classical education. These people had been educated in Latin and Greek. They'd memorized long passages of ancient texts. They'd been trained in rhetoric and oratory, which required being able to deliver hours-long speeches from memory. This kind of education had fallen out of fashion by the 1930s, but there was still a generation of people who'd been through it. And these were the people the British government recruited to Bletchley Park. One of the techniques they used was something called the method of loci, or the memory palace technique. This is the same method the ancient Greeks and Romans used, the same method that medieval scholars used to memorize entire books before printing was invented. Here's how it works for code breaking. Let's say you're trying to crack a cipher, and you need to keep track of letter frequencies. In German text, certain letters appear more often than others. E is the most common letter, followed by N, then I, then S, and so on. When you're looking at an encrypted message, you're trying to figure out which encrypted letters correspond to which real letters. And to do that, you need to hold in your mind the frequency patterns of both the encrypted text and normal German text, and look for matches. Most people would write this down on paper, make charts and tables, but that takes time. And in code breaking, speed matters. The faster you can crack a code, the more valuable the intelligence. The code breakers at Bletchley Park would create memory palaces to hold all this information. They'd imagine a familiar building, like their childhood home, and they'd place different pieces of information in different rooms. In the entryway, they'd see the letter E, huge and glowing, because it's the most common. In the living room, the letter N. In the kitchen, the letter I. Each letter had its own location. Then they'd do the same thing for the encrypted message, but they'd use a different building, maybe their school. And as they analyzed the encrypted text, they'd walk through this mental school, placing letters in different rooms based on how often they appeared. Then comes the magic part. They'd mentally stand between the two buildings and look for matches. Which room in the school has the same feel as which room in the house? Which encrypted letter appears with the same frequency as which real letter? This sounds weird, but it works. Because your brain is incredibly good at spatial reasoning and pattern matching when information is organized spatially. And the code breakers at Bletchley Park got so good at this that they could hold multiple memory palaces in their heads at once. They could mentally walk through different buildings, comparing patterns, testing hypotheses, all without writing anything down. But memory palaces weren't the only technique they used. There was another method that was even more important for code breaking. It's called chunking. And it's the secret to how experts in any field can hold so much more information in their heads than beginners. Here's how chunking works. If I give you a random sequence of letters like JF, KF, BICIANSA, you'd have a hard time remembering it. That's 12 individual pieces of information, which is more than most people can hold in their short-term memory. But if I break it up into chunks, JFK, FBI, CIA, NSA, suddenly it's easy, because now it's not 12 random letters. It's 4 meaningful chunks, and 4 chunks is well within what your working memory can handle. The codebreakers at Bletchley Park became masters of chunking. When they looked at an encrypted message, they didn't see individual letters, they saw patterns, chunks of letters that appeared together frequently, sequences that had meaning even when encrypted. Alan Turing discovered that German radio operators had habits. When they sent weather reports, they'd often start the message with the word Wetter, which is German for weather. When they sent nothing important, they'd often include the phrase keine besonderen Ereignisse, which means nothing special to report. These repeated phrases were called cribs in code-breaking terminology. And if you knew a message probably contained a certain phrase, you could use that to crack the code. But here's the thing. To use cribs effectively, you had to have them all memorized. You had to know common German military phrases, standard message formats, operator habits, everything. And you had to be able to instantly recall this information when you saw a pattern that might match. The codebreakers at Bletchley Park memorized thousands of these cribs. They'd study intercepted messages and German military documents, committing common phrases to memory. Then when they were working on a new encrypted message, all these cribs would be sitting in their minds, ready to be matched against the encrypted text. Dilly Knox, one of the senior codebreakers, had an almost supernatural ability with this. He could look at an encrypted message and just know what it probably said. Other codebreakers would ask him how he knew, and he couldn't really explain it. He'd just say he could feel it. But it wasn't magic or intuition. It was memory. Knox had internalized so many patterns, so many cribs, so many examples of German military communication, that his brain could pattern match automatically. He didn't have to consciously think through the possibilities. His memory did the work for him. This is exactly how chess grandmasters work, by the way. A chess master can look at a board position for 5 seconds and remember exactly where all the pieces are. A beginner can't do that. But it's not because the master has a better memory. It's because the master sees chunks, where a beginner sees 32 individual pieces in random positions. A master sees familiar patterns. This group of pieces is a standard opening position. That group is a common defensive formation. Those pieces are setting up a known attacking pattern. The master isn't remembering 32 individual things. They're remembering maybe 5 or 6 meaningful chunks, and that's easy. The codebreakers at Bletchley Park did the same thing with encrypted messages. They learned to see patterns in chunks instead of individual letters, and this allowed them to hold far more information in their working memory than should have been possible. But there was another memory technique they used that was even more important, and this one is so powerful that it's still classified in some contexts today. It's called eidetic memory training, and it's the ability to remember visual information with photographic accuracy. Now, true photographic memory probably doesn't exist. The idea that someone can look at a page of text for a few seconds and then recall it word for word is mostly a myth, but you can train yourself to remember visual information with extraordinary accuracy. And the British intelligence services had been training people to do this since World War I. Here's how the training worked. They'd show someone a complex image, a map, a diagram, a page of text, for 30 seconds. Then they'd take it away and ask the person to recreate it from memory. At first, people could only remember a few details, but with practice, they got better, much better. After months of training, people could look at a map for 30 seconds and then draw it from memory with almost perfect accuracy. They could look at a page of text and remember the general layout, the important words, the overall structure, not word for word, but close enough to be useful. This skill was critical for code breaking because you couldn't always keep physical copies of messages. For security reasons, many documents had to be destroyed after they were analyzed. But if you could remember them visually, you could still compare them to other messages later. Several of the code breakers at Bletchley Park had been through this eidetic memory training, and they used it constantly. They'd memorize the layout of encrypted messages, the patterns of letters, the structure of the code. Then when they saw a new message, they could mentally compare it to all the previous messages they'd memorized. One codebreaker named John Harrival had a breakthrough in 1940 because of this skill. He noticed that when German operators set up their Enigma machines each day, they sometimes got lazy. Instead of choosing truly random starting positions for the rotors, they'd choose positions that were close to wherever the rotors happened to be at the end of the previous day. But to notice this pattern, Harrival had to remember the rotor positions from multiple days and compare them. He couldn't write this information down because it was too sensitive, so he memorized it. He kept days and days worth of rotor positions in his head, and when he mentally reviewed them, he saw the pattern. This pattern, which became known as the Harrival tip, allowed the British to crack Enigma more quickly during the period when the Germans were getting lazy with their rotor settings. And during those periods, the British could read German military communications almost in real time. The Battle of Britain was happening during this period. German bombers were attacking British cities every night. And because Bletchley Park could read the German messages, the British often knew where the bombers would attack before they took off. RAF fighters could be positioned in advance. Anti-aircraft batteries could be ready. Civilians could be evacuated from the most dangerous areas. The death toll was still horrific, but it would have been far worse without the intelligence from Bletchley Park. And that intelligence was possible because people like John Harrival could hold vast amounts of information in their memories and see patterns that others missed. Now, you might be thinking this all sounds great, but these were exceptional people, geniuses, people with natural gifts that normal people don't have. But that's not true, and I can prove it. After the war, British intelligence wanted to keep using these memory techniques, but they had a problem. The people who'd worked at Bletchley Park were getting older, and many of them wanted to retire. So British intelligence needed to train a new generation, and they discovered something shocking. Almost anyone could learn these techniques. It wasn't about being born smart. It was about training. They started recruiting ordinary people, office workers, teachers, shop clerks, people with no special background or education, and they put them through intensive memory training. The training lasted 6 months, During that time, the recruits practiced memory palaces for hours each day. They memorized long lists of random information. They learned chunking techniques. They went through eidetic memory training. And at the end of 6 months, these ordinary people could do things that seemed impossible. They could memorize hundreds of random digits. They could look at a complex diagram and recreate it from memory. They could hold multiple streams of information in their heads simultaneously and see patterns across all of them. They weren't geniuses. They were just people who'd been trained. This raises an obvious question. If these techniques are so powerful, why doesn't everyone use them? Why aren't we teaching this stuff in schools? The answer is complicated, but it comes down to 2 main things. First, most people don't know these techniques exist. The work at Bletchley Park was classified until the 1970s. By the time the information was declassified, the people who knew these techniques were old or dead, and the knowledge had been lost. Second, modern education decided that memorization was bad. Starting in the 1960s and 70s, there was a big push to stop making students memorize things. The argument was that rote memorization was mindless and didn't develop real understanding. And there's some truth to that. Just repeating facts over and over without understanding them isn't very useful. But the baby got thrown out with the bathwater. The sophisticated memory techniques that people like the Bletchley Park Codebreakers used weren't rote memorization. They were about creating deep, meaningful connections between pieces of information. When you use a memory palace, you're not just memorizing isolated facts. You're creating a spatial structure where different pieces of information relate to each other. When you use chunking, you're finding meaningful patterns. When you train eidetic memory, you're developing your visual processing abilities. These techniques don't replace understanding. They enhance it. They give you the ability to hold more information in your mind at once, which allows you to see connections and patterns that you'd miss otherwise. But modern education treats memory and understanding as opposites. You either memorize stuff mindlessly, or you understand concepts deeply. The idea that you could do both, that memory training could actually enhance understanding, has been mostly forgotten. There are a few places where memory training is still taken seriously. Intelligence agencies still use these techniques. So do professional poker players, who need to remember which cards have been played. So do memory athletes, who compete in memory championships. But for the average person, these techniques are unknown, which is crazy when you think about it. We have access to methods that can dramatically improve our cognitive abilities, and we're just not using them. Let me give you a concrete example of how powerful these techniques are. In 2006, a journalist named Joshua Foer heard about memory competitions and decided to investigate. He had zero background in memory training, just a normal guy with a normal memory. He started training with a memory champion, learning the same techniques that the Bletchley Park Codebreakers used: memory palaces, chunking, visual encoding. He practiced for about an hour a day. After just 1 year of training, Foer competed in the USA Memory Championship, and he won. He beat people who'd been training for years. He memorized a shuffled deck of cards in under 2 minutes. He memorized hundreds of random digits. He memorized long lists of random words. And again, this wasn't because he had any special talent. He was just a journalist who decided to learn these techniques. If he could do it in a year, imagine what you could do with consistent practice. But let's get back to Bletchley Park, because there's more to this story. The memory techniques were crucial, but they weren't the only secret. The other key factor was the way the codebreakers collaborated. See, codebreaking is too complex for any one person to do alone. You need different people with different skills working together. Some people are good at spotting patterns. Others are good at mathematical analysis. Others are good at understanding the context and meaning of messages. At Bletchley Park, they organized people into teams called huts because they literally worked in temporary wooden huts scattered around the grounds. Each hut focused on a different aspect of the code-breaking process. And here's where the memory techniques became even more powerful, because when everyone on the team has a highly trained memory, they can share information much more efficiently. In a normal team, if someone discovers something, they have to write it down, pass the note to someone else, wait for them to read it, explain it, answer questions. It's slow and clunky. But at Bletchley Park, people could just talk. One codebreaker could say, "I've got a pattern in messages from Army Group South. Letter frequency suggests they're using rotor settings similar to what we saw last Tuesday." And everyone else would immediately know what they were talking about, because they all had the previous messages memorized. They all knew the rotor settings from last Tuesday. They all understood the significance of the letter frequencies. Information flowed between people almost telepathically. Someone would mention a small detail, and someone else would immediately connect it to something they'd noticed 3 days ago, and suddenly you'd have a breakthrough. This kind of collaboration is only possible when everyone has a highly trained memory, because you can't collaborate effectively if you can't remember what everyone else is working on. Alan Turing understood this better than anyone. He wasn't just a brilliant mathematician, he was a brilliant organizer. He structured the work at Bletchley Park so that information could flow freely between different teams. He created systems where people would regularly share what they discovered. Not formal reports, just conversations, quick updates, little observations. And because everyone had these memory techniques, all these little pieces of information would stick. They'd accumulate in people's minds, forming a shared body of knowledge that everyone could draw on. This is actually one of the biggest advantages that Bletchley Park had over the Germans. The Germans had smart people too. They had mathematicians and cryptographers, but they were more siloed. Information didn't flow between different groups. People worked in isolation. At Bletchley Park, everyone was constantly talking to everyone else, sharing ideas, testing hypotheses, building on each other's work, and their trained memories made this collaboration far more effective than it would have been otherwise. There's a specific incident that shows how powerful this was. In early 1942, the Germans made a major change to their naval Enigma system. They added a fourth rotor to the machines used by U-boats. This made the code exponentially harder to crack. For 10 months, the British couldn't read German naval messages. And during those 10 months, U-boats sank Allied ships at a terrifying rate. It was called the Second Happy Time by German submariners, because they could operate with impunity. Thousands of Allied sailors died. Millions of tons of supplies were lost. Britain was on the verge of being starved into submission. But in December 1942, the codebreakers at Bletchley Park finally cracked the four-rotor naval Enigma, and the way they did it is a perfect example of memory-enhanced collaboration. Multiple teams had been working on the problem for months. Each team had pieces of the puzzle. One team had figured out some characteristics of the fourth rotor. Another team had identified patterns in operator behavior. A third team had discovered a weakness in how the Germans were using the system. Individually, none of these discoveries was enough to crack the code, but when you put them all together, they pointed to a solution. The breakthrough happened during a casual conversation. Several codebreakers were having lunch, discussing what they'd been working on, and as they talked, each person was mentally reviewing everything they'd learned over the past 10 months. All the failed attempts, all the dead ends, all the small insights that hadn't led anywhere. And suddenly, someone made a connection. They realized that if you combine the rotor characteristics that one team had discovered with the operator behavior patterns that another team had found, and then applied the weakness that the third team had identified, you could drastically narrow down the possible settings. Within hours, they'd cracked a message. Within days, they were reading German naval communications again. And the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic turned. U-boat losses skyrocketed. Allied shipping losses plummeted. The supplies needed to prepare for D-Day started flowing safely across the Atlantic. And this breakthrough was possible because a group of people with highly trained memories could hold months' worth of complex information in their heads and suddenly see how it all fit together. Historians estimate that the work at Bletchley Park shortened World War II by at least 2 years, possibly more. 2 years fewer of people dying in concentration camps, 2 years fewer of cities being bombed, 2 years fewer of soldiers dying in combat, millions of lives saved. And it was possible because a group of people learned to use their memories in ways that most people today can't even imagine. Now I want to talk about what happened after the war, because this is where the story gets really interesting. The British government recognized how valuable these memory techniques were, so they decided to keep training people in these methods, not just for intelligence work, but for all kinds of government and military positions. There were secret training programs throughout the 1950s and 60s where people were taught advanced memory techniques. Some of this has been declassified, but a lot of it remains classified even today. Why would memory training still be classified 70 years later? Because it's still being used. Intelligence agencies around the world still train their people in these techniques. They're considered a strategic advantage. Think about it. If you're a spy operating in hostile territory, you can't carry documents with you. Everything important has to be in your head. You need to remember faces, names, conversations, patterns of behavior. And you need to remember it all perfectly because lives depend on it. So intelligence agencies invest heavily in memory training. They use modern versions of the same techniques that were used at Bletchley Park. And they keep the details secret because they don't want their adversaries to know exactly how their people are trained. But here's what really bothers me about this. These techniques aren't secret because they don't work. They're secret because they work too well. Imagine if everyone had access to this kind of memory training. If every student learned these techniques in school. If everyone could remember information with the kind of accuracy and detail that the Bletchley Park Codebreakers had. How would that change education? How would that change the job market? How would that change political debates when everyone could remember exactly what politicians said 6 months ago and hold them accountable? There are people in power who benefit from the general population having poor memories. It's easier to manipulate people who can't remember what happened last year. It's easier to rewrite history when nobody remembers the details. I'm not saying there's a grand conspiracy to keep these techniques secret, but I am saying that the people who know about these techniques, who use them, who benefit from them, don't have much incentive to spread them widely. And meanwhile, the rest of us are told that memory doesn't matter anymore, that we can just Google whatever we need to know, that memorization is old-fashioned and unnecessary. But that's a lie. Memory matters more than ever, because the ability to hold information in your head, to see patterns, to make connections, to think deeply about complex topics, all of that requires memory. When you outsource your memory to your phone or your computer, you're not freeing up your brain to think about more important things. You're crippling your ability to think at all. The codebreakers at Bletchley Park could do what they did because they had all the relevant information in their heads. They could see patterns because they could hold multiple messages in their memory simultaneously. They could make breakthroughs because they could mentally compare information from different sources without having to constantly look things up. If they'd had to rely on external memory aids, they wouldn't have been nearly as effective. The constant interruption of looking things up would have broken their concentration. They wouldn't have been able to see the patterns. The war would have lasted longer. And the same principle applies to any kind of complex thinking. If you want to really understand something, if you want to see connections that others miss, if you want to have insights and breakthroughs, you need to hold the relevant information in your memory. This is why the smartest people in any field tend to have exceptional memories. Not because smart people naturally have good memories, but because developing your memory makes you smarter. Einstein could work on complex physics problems in his head because he had all the relevant equations and principles memorized. He didn't have to stop and look things up. The information was just there, ready to be used. Shakespeare could write plays with intricate plots and hundreds of characters because he held all that information in his head simultaneously. He could see how different storylines would intersect, how different characters would interact, because they were all present in his memory. Mozart could compose entire symphonies in his head because he had a vast library of musical patterns and structures memorized. He wasn't just randomly putting notes together. He was drawing on patterns he'd learned and remembered. These people weren't born with superhuman abilities. They developed them through practice and training. And you can too. The techniques used at Bletchley Park aren't magic. They're just methods that align with how your brain actually works. Your brain is incredibly good at spatial reasoning, so memory palaces work. Your brain is good at pattern recognition, so chunking works. Your brain is good at visual processing, so eidetic memory training works. These are natural human abilities. You already have them. You're already using them, just not in a systematic way. If you learn to use them intentionally, you can do things that seem impossible. Let me give you a practical example. Say you're in a meeting, and your boss is explaining a new project. There are multiple deadlines, several different teams involved, various dependencies between tasks. Normally, you'd be frantically taking notes, trying to capture everything. But if you use memory techniques, you can just listen. You create a memory palace, maybe your childhood home. You put the first deadline in the kitchen, the second deadline in the living room. You represent different teams as different people you know and place them in appropriate rooms. You create visual connections to represent dependencies, and now the whole project structure is in your head as a coherent spatial layout. You can mentally walk through it any time. You can see the relationships between different elements. You can spot potential problems because you can see the whole structure at once. This isn't just better than taking notes, it's a fundamentally different level of understanding. When information is organized spatially in your memory, you can manipulate it, examine it from different angles, see implications that you'd miss if you were just reading notes. This is what the Bletchley Park Codebreakers were doing, just applied to encrypted messages instead of project plans. And once you develop these skills, they apply to everything. Reading becomes more effective because you remember what you read. Conversations become richer because you remember what people said. Learning becomes faster because you can build new knowledge on top of a solid foundation of remembered information. Your whole relationship with information changes. Instead of constantly feeling like you're drowning in data you can't keep track of, you start to feel like you have a handle on things. You can hold multiple threads in your head at once. You can see the big picture while keeping track of the details. This is what cognitive empowerment actually looks like. Not just having access to information, but having it organized in your mind in ways that let you use it effectively. And here's the beautiful thing. The more you practice these techniques, the easier they get. At first, creating a memory palace feels awkward and forced, but after you've done it 100 times, it becomes automatic. You can create a memory palace in seconds without even thinking about it. This is what happened to the codebreakers at Bletchley Park. By the end of the war, they were using these techniques so automatically that they didn't even realize they were doing it. It had become their natural way of thinking, and the same can happen for you. These techniques aren't something you use occasionally for special purposes. They become your default way of processing information. And once that happens, your cognitive abilities are permanently enhanced. So why am I telling you all this? What's the point of this long story about World War II codebreakers? Because I want you to understand that you're capable of so much more than you think. The limitations you experience with your memory aren't natural. They're not inevitable. They're just the result of not having learned the right techniques. The people at Bletchley Park weren't superheroes. They were ordinary people who learned extraordinary skills. And you can learn those same skills. The techniques exist. They've been proven to work. They're not secret anymore, even if they're not widely taught. All the information you need is out there if you look for it. The only question is whether you're willing to put in the time to learn them. Because here's the truth. These techniques require practice. You can't just read about them and suddenly have a perfect memory. You have to actually do the work. You have to practice creating memory palaces. You have to practice chunking. You have to train your visual memory. It takes time. Probably several months of regular practice before you start seeing major improvements. And that's why most people never do it. They want instant results. They want a magic pill or a life hack that requires zero effort. But anything worth having requires work. And the ability to use your mind at its full potential is definitely worth the work. The codebreakers at Bletchley Park changed the course of history because they developed their cognitive abilities to an extraordinary level. They saved millions of lives because they could think in ways that other people couldn't. You have the same potential, the same basic cognitive hardware, the same capacity to develop these skills. The only difference is they were trained and you weren't. But that can change, starting today, if you wanted to. So here's my challenge to you. Don't just watch this video and forget about it. Don't just think, wow, that's interesting, and move on with your life. Actually do something. Pick one memory technique and start practicing it. Create a memory palace for your grocery list. Try chunking the next time you need to remember a phone number. Practice visual memory by looking at images and trying to recreate them from memory. Start small. Be patient with yourself, but start. Because every person who develops these abilities is one more person who can think clearly in a world that desperately needs clear thinking. One more person who can see through manipulation and propaganda because they remember what was actually said. One more person who can solve complex problems because they can hold all the relevant information in their head at once. The legacy of Bletchley Park isn't just that they won a war. It's that they proved what human cognition is capable of when properly trained. And that legacy belongs to you, if you're willing to claim it. Subscribe to learn the memory technique even intelligence agencies don't want you to know.